We continue our journey, psychoanalysis and Indian tradition. First small part we completed was of Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Second part, now we will take up Brahmasutras. Brahmasutras are important because Brahmasutras try to synthesize the Upanishads and reconcile the differences that are found in Upanishads apparently. The way different Upanishads are written, to a lay reader or an ordinary person, it may appear there are contradictions, and the Brahma Sutras resolves those contradictions. So the Brahma Sutra distills the essence of all the Upanishads, even as it reconciles and synthesizes the teachings of Upanishads. Brahma Sutras, therefore, is one book that contains the wisdom of many Upanishads. At the same time, it tries to reconcile the appearing differences. So it's like a commentary on all Upanishads put together. So let us go into the Brahma Sutras and see how we can understand them as they are, and also from a psychoanalytic standpoint. Because the Brahma Sutras deal largely with Upanishads, the topics discussed in Brahma Sutras largely are philosophical, and therefore on most issues, the issues go beyond the scope of psychoanalysis. But where we can, we will do a commentary from a psychoanalytic standpoint. What the Brahma Sutras are? It's a book written by sage Vyasa. There is a controversy if the sage Vyasa was the same Ved Vyasa who wrote Mahabharata, or there is some other person with the title of Vyasa. Correspondingly, the date of creation of Brahma Sutras also is in controversy. Some believe it was written by the sage Ved Vyasa of Mahabharata fame, and Brahma Sutras got written around 400-500 BC. Some believe it was written in 300 to 400 AD by somebody other than Ved Vyasa, but the title was Vyasa. And Vyasa also is a surname. My personal opinion is that Brahma Sutras seem to have been written by somebody with a title Vyasa and not Ved Vyas himself. Not only that, because I say that because if we look at Bhagavad Gita by Ved Vyas, if you look at Mahabharata by Ved Vyas, and if we look at Brahma Sutras, there is a difference. There is a difference of rigor, of intensity, of clarity, of flavor. And at many places in Brahma Sutras, we find compared to Gita, the depth and the clarity is less. There is also another aspect to it. Some of the sutras, they don't seem to belong to either Ved-Vyasa or Vyasa. They seem to be inserted by somebody else much later on. And this appears because there is suddenly a break of the depth at which you are dealing with issues. From dealing with very intellectual issues, you suddenly come to very ordinary, petty social issues. So there is also an element of insertion and contamination of Brahmasutras. This brings us to the point that in fact we require a commission to go into all the ancient texts, not only of Hindus but of all religions, and remove from there what seems to be later insertions, done with a variety of motivations. So to me it appears Brahma Sutras is a creation of somebody with a title Vyasa rather than Ved Vyasa. Brahma Sutras is very important because in the Hindu tradition there is a concept of Prasthantrayi. Trayi means three. So the three most important books in the spiritual literature are believed to be Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, and Gita. And it is said if you understand these three or any one of them, you can make a transition from this world into a world of liberation, freedom, mukti. You can do the prasthan, or you can make a move out of. You can take leave of this compulsive birth and rebirth. And therefore, the three books which help you to do a prasthan or take leave from this compulsive world, they are known as prasthantrayi. Three books that can help you get out of the compulsive birth and rebirth. And Brahma Sutra is among one of them. This tells us about the importance of Brahma Sutras. Brahma Sutras are also important because in the scholarly tradition in India, unless you do a commentary on these three, Upanishads or the Vedas, Brahma Sutras and Gita, unless you do commentary on all these three of a very good quality which can earn the title of Bhashya or credible commentary or sacred commentary, unless somebody does it giving a very high quality sacred commentary on these three books, tradition does not call that person an acharya or a sacred teacher. So in that spiritual world, there are rishis, there are gurus, there are acharyas. So it is very important for somebody who is in the spiritual world, if he is interested in these things, if he wants to be an acharya, he has to give a high quality something that can be called a sacred commentary on this theme. So this is the importance of Brahmasutras. What is the book Brahmasutras about and why was it written? The Brahmasutra as a book is divided into 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is called Samanvay Adhyaya. Adhyaya is chapter. The flavor and the content of the first is Samanvay, harmony, reconciliation. Second is Avirodha, which means there is no opposition to what is being said here. Third is Sadhana, how to do spiritual process so that one attains liberation. And Phala, the result. When you undertake this process, how do you get the results? So each of these 4 chapters deals thematically with these themes. The first talks about harmony among all the Upanishads, even while some of the statements of one Upanishad may appear contradictory to some statement of another Upanishad. So Samanvaya is resolving contradictions, reconciliations, harmony. Second is Avirodha, that there is no opposition to what is being said either in the Upanishads or in the Brahmasutras from any credible authority. Third is sadhana, how to undertake the spiritual process for liberation. Fourth, what are the results you get after you undertake the spiritual process. Each chapter is further divided into 4 parts. 1, 2, 3, 4. And each chapter deals with certain number of themes or ideas. First chapter deals with, broadly speaking, 39 ideas or themes. Second, 47. Third, 67. Fourth, 38. This number can vary based upon how you group or classify what is being discussed in terms of ideational categories. Each of these themes further is discussed in terms of small statements, aphorisms called sutras. And in the whole book, there are a total of 555 sutras. So this is the structure of the book. Why was the book written in the first place? What was the need for it? This book was written because Vyasa felt that the deeper inner spiritual experiences talked about in the Upanishads, because they are rare experiences and not experienced by most people, what was spoken by the creators of Upanishad, who had access to those rare experiences, because people did not have the rare experiences which were behind the utterances that make up the Upanishads. People took it at face value, scholars took it at face value, because most scholars did not have the rare experience, they only had the intellectual ability. So seemingly there appear to be contradictions between different Upanishads, as though they were talking about different things. And very strong disputes started happening between people who liked different Upanishads. And the openness, the oneness, the spiritual pluralism, and the open seeking of the Upanishads, that was taking a back seat. And in that context, sage Vyasa felt that there was a need for clarification, reconciliation, synthesis, pluralism, and bringing experience to the center of the study of Upanishads. Because all the 3 Upanishads, Brahmasutras, and Gita, unless one has those rare spiritual experiences, based upon which these works are written, one cannot really understand what is written there. Ordinary intellectual commentary goes only halfway. Without the rare experiences which are a prerequisite to understand these three books and scriptures like this, any other scripture like this. And if we don't have teachers who have those experiences for a long time in history, people start misinterpreting those books and then fighting over them. So this was the context in which sage Vyasa felt a book of synthesis, of reconciliation, of clarification, of re-establishment of pluralism and spiritual inner experience at the center of spirituality was needed. And therefore he wrote Brahmasutras. This is like a compendium of wisdom of all Upanishads, and therefore in one sense this is a book of books. So what does the Brahma Sutra do? It essentially tries to synthesize, clarify the Upanishads. But there is definitely, so first I feel it is done by later Vyasa, not Ved Vyasa. Because at many points in Brahma Sutras, one feels a lowering of depth compared to the Gita. It should not be there. Actually, it should be more difficult, more rigorous, more deeper than Gita. But that is not what one feels. Second, as I said, there are many insertions by motivated individuals later on. One can easily make out, especially on some comments on eligibility to understand the Vedas and Upanishads for non-Brahmanical lower castes, completely out of place and completely unacceptable and casteist. These are later insertions by motivated individuals, not the original Brahma Sutra. So the original Brahma Sutra has to be filtered out of what is passing off as Brahma Sutra today. We also see a problem in the Brahma Sutra where something is proven using the authority of scripture. So it would say X is true because the scripture says X is true. And that is a very weak way of proving something. Because then the question of the scripture you are referring to will come in. And then either you uphold experience and logic, or you make a superstition out of the scripture. So that openness comes into question, the pluralism comes into question, the primacy of lived experience comes into question. And the fourth, there is contamination of the type that I referred to. Some sutras are casteist and they don't belong to the Brahma Sutras. They have been inserted in later on. How can then the objective of Brahma Sutras can be achieved? We will see how Brahma Sutra tries to do it. So Brahma Sutra tries to achieve the synthesis of all Upanishads and reconciliation by analytical argumentation of if in Upanishad A, X is written and in Upanishad B, Y is written, to say that X and Y are not opposite, analysis is done of X and Y and the context in which they are written. And you prove that X and Y are not opposing each other. Or you say Y is wrong because scriptures don't say Y is correct. Those are the two broad approaches that Brahmasutra uses for synthesis. Analysis of something on its own merit in the context of Hindu spirituality, or reference to the scripture, which is usually the Veda. Is there another way the same thing can be done? The synthesis of Upanishads can be achieved. Is there another way? Yes, there is. And the way out is this. So what the Brahmasutras tries to do, you can do the same thing in a different way. The first thing there is establishment of pluralism. Pluralism in philosophy, spiritual experiences, and the definition of enlightenment. Philosophy like how did the existence come into being? Is Purusha and Prakriti coming from the same source? Did Prakriti come later, or was it always there, as Sankhya would say? These are the philosophical questions where, if we accept the humble pragmatic position that in philosophy nobody of us can be certain, and we are using the instrument that we have to know something which is very difficult for this instrument to know. Once we bring in the element of humility and pluralism and openness, you don't even have to reconcile. You can allow plural points of view to coexist. And people can choose based on what appeals to them. So this is one, pluralism in philosophy. Second, if we accept plurality of spiritual experiences, that some people attain enlightenment by a state of no thought and bliss and high awareness. This is the state. Some go into pure consciousness, Kevalya. Some go into all-cancelling nihilism, nirvana. Some experience the psychic being. Some experience oneness with existence. And there are a variety of spiritual experiences which are called enlightenment experiences. And at this moment, when we are not sure if one spiritual way of enlightenment is better than the other, we just allow the plurality of spiritual experiences without going into the relative profundity of any of them. And if we allow that plurality of spiritual experiences, the reconciliation by a process of elimination is not necessary. Similarly, when we have this experience of enlightenment defined in various ways and multiple definitions accepted, fights go away. Pluralism and subjectivity comes to stay in harmony. So pluralism in philosophy, spiritual experiences, and enlightenment, if we go by this, much of the problem is solved. Even if we don't have synthesis, we have a plural coexistence. And in many cases, we have synthesis also. The same person can undergo multiple spiritual experiences. Then comes the question of the human integer. How are we constituted? What are our faculties? What belongs to us proper and what belongs to nature in general? So Brahma Sutra at one point enters into this theme that within us, what is it that we can call us and what is it that we can call nature? What is it that we call Brahma and what is it we can call something individual? So if we have a clear definition of the human integer, the synthesis of these points can be done, and the confusion of whether to think of one's constituents as one's own or as belonging to nature, that can be overcome. If we take a common origin both of consciousness and nature, and both working together in a purposive way, harmony is established. Third important point is not to confuse spirituality with philosophy. Spiritual experiences are one thing and philosophy is quite another. Spiritual experiences are real experiences. Philosophy is a flight of ideas. It is a flight of intuition. It need not be of the same concrete reality or experience as our spiritual experiences are. So we should separate the spiritual experiences and the philosophy. Philosophy is largely intellectual, amorphous, can have a flight of fancy, can have speculation, but the spiritual experiences are very concrete, very existential. So separation of spirituality and philosophy, often they get confused in Upanishads and we wrongly confuse them. In the sense, they don't get confused in Upanishads, we wrongly confuse them in the sense, we don't separate a spiritual statement, a statement of spiritual experience from a philosophical statement. And philosophy can easily go wrong, but the spiritual experiences are very correct. So not to fight spiritual experiences or statements elaborating spiritual experiences with philosophy. If we look at Sri Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo's philosophy is model of the mind, his model of reality and the human integer. And if we put together spiritual pluralism, which already is there, but just to mention it as a separate important phrase, if we put this together, much of the goal of Brahma Sutra already is achieved here. If you put together Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and spiritual pluralism of philosophy, experiences, and enlightenment definitions, much of the synthesis already is achieved. We don't have to go into the argumentation, the proving, the citing of scriptural authority as Brahma Sutra does if we go this way. So this is also one way. So if we do these 3-4 things, it's another way, a much easier way, and in my view, far more convincing way than the way Brahma Sutras goes about. How does Brahma Sutra do the synthesis? One very important element of Brahma Sutra is its engagement with the concept of Brahma. I mean, it's the very name is Brahmasutra. Sutras related to Brahma. So Brahma is a core concept in Brahmasutras. And therefore, the concept of Brahma has to be understood from various points if we want to understand Brahmasutra. There are various ways in which Brahma is talked about in Brahmasutra. One way is to say Brahma is almost a synonym of God, and to say nothing exists except God. So in that sense, Brahma becomes the ground of existence, Brahma becomes the existence, Brahma becomes the soul, and Brahma becomes nature. Second way to look at Brahma is to say that God or reality is something different. And the reality creates a Brahma, the principle. And the principle or Brahma in turn creates the universe. And in that creation, it also becomes the efficient and the material cause both. So there is a transcendent Brahma, a universal Brahma, and the immanent Brahma. Some people talk only about universal Brahma and the immanent Brahma. And in the immanent Brahma, the immanence is in consciousness and in nature. And nature, therefore, is also partly conscious. This is the model that I prefer: reality or God creating the Brahma, and the Brahma creating the universe. And the reality is not exhausted by creating the Brahma. It can create many of them, and each of them can create a very different universe with different laws and the first principles. This is also a story, a very famous story, where Brahma comes to meet Lord Krishna and asks him how many Brahmas are there. And he calls all of them Brahmas of all universes, the first principles of all universes. And universe other than ours are much bigger. And in our universe, the Brahma has three faces, meaning there are 3 points of creation from where something emerges in the first place. So there are 3 points of primal creation in our universe. Similarly, different universes have different numbers of points of primal creation, symbolized by Brahma with different number of heads, the creative principle with different number of heads or points. So one way to conceptualize this is reality creating Brahma. In Brahma Sutras, at many points, it seems as though the model is not of a reality creating a Brahma, but only Brahma being reality. The idea is not of a multiverse, but seems to be of a single universe. Multiverse will automatically lead to a model of reality creating many Brahmas. But here we have only one Brahma identified with reality. So then the Brahma becomes the principle of the universe, of all existence. It also becomes a universal anchor, unchanging, immortal, ceaseless, from which everything proceeds in that universe. It also becomes immanent in that universe, in both consciousness and matter, and consciousness in matter. It also is in evolution and above evolution. It has a purpose and no purpose. But in evolution, it has a purpose. The individual faculties and constitutional entities, in essence, are nothing but the Brahman. And the emergence of nature, constitution, intelligence in nature, evolution of nature also is because of Brahman. And there is a significance of Prakriti, of nature. So there are two ways of looking at nature. One only as an obstacle, and second as an active, creative entity in evolution, just as consciousness is. So just as an individual soul is evolving, so is nature evolving. So Brahma Sutra gets largely into this kind of issues. Largely a discussion on Brahma. And if we take recourse to Sri Aurobindo, spiritual pluralism, and if we complement it with what Osho said, Buddha the Zorba, consciousness and nature, pleasure and enlightenment, materialism and spirituality, both, neither pure subjective idealism nor pure materialism. If we look into Yoga Sutras and we look at holistic flavor of the sadhana, and if we separate spirituality and philosophy and bring in open pluralism, spiritual pluralism, the synthesis that Brahma Sutra talks about becomes very easy to understand. And where we have a difference, it's easy to even justify the difference and criticize the Brahma Sutras. So this is the broad central core into which the Brahma Sutra goes. So the first important element that Brahma Sutra goes into and constantly keeps talking about is the idea of the Brahma. The second important element, I'm talking the first chapter of Brahma Sutras. The core element talked about is the Brahma. The second element is the structure and functioning of the individual. And there we can talk about consciousness, which can take different positions, stations, multiple 5 bodies that Tantra talks about, and the chakras. Brahma Sutra does not go into this, but it goes into faculties. So that flavor of Brahma Sutra resembles more the Advaita flavor rather than the Tantra flavor. And one thing that Brahma Sutra misses is, and that most of the Indian spirituality misses, is these different states of rare experience, which are termed as enlightenment by different schools of spirituality. It's only Patanjali who talks about all of them. Although he also does not deal with it with such clarity as we are dealing with here, but he does talk about state of samadhi and the near states of samadhi. Something like a quarter samadhi, a half samadhi, 3/4 samadhi. But to be more clear, this is something which is very necessary, that these states of equanimity, of stillness, state of no thought, psychic being, nirvana, oneness, pure consciousness of Kevalya, all these states are clubbed together under the element of category word of enlightenment, moksha or mukti or samadhi. So since we have done this in Yoga Sutras, we won't go much in details here. But these states are very necessary to understand, and once you understand this, much of the conflict goes away. So this is very important for resolution of conflict in Upanishads and achieving the harmonious synthesis that Brahma Sutra wants to achieve. So we will see that in different ways, these concepts indirectly get referred to. The concept of human integer indirectly gets referred to. From a psychoanalytic standpoint, the spiritual experiences are rare experiences which have not yet been incorporated in psychoanalysis. Sri Aurobindo's model of the mind also remains to be incorporated. It's among the most comprehensive models of the mind. The limits of human potential in terms of spiritual goals. Goal states that each spiritual school sets up for itself. Those goal states also remain to be incorporated. Philosophically, even if we don't incorporate into psychoanalysis something from this, doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter from standpoint of practice. It does matter from a conceptual standpoint, although. What is very important here is the element of purpose. That if we believe the human consciousness and nature both have a purpose, both are in evolution, it becomes possible to understand more clearly purpose in terms of history, purpose in terms of social context in which we live. And both these things have a very strong impact on the way our minds operate. The social psychology aspect of our mind not accorded right significance in psychoanalysis. That area receives a lot of light, clarification. When we get into this discussion of the context from a philosophical standpoint, Sri Aurobindo talks about cultural ages. The age of collectivity, the age of individualism, the age of spirituality. And we see that spirit of the age informing the social context and therefore informing the way our minds operate, including the pathology. Kohut makes a very important observation. He says the type of patients Freud used to get and the type of patients he gets are very different. He calls Freud's patients as the guilty man and his patients as the tragic man. The guilty man is a drive frustration model patient. The tragic man is a object loss, not good enough object, suffering patient. So when we get from this philosophical point to explaining of the social context, we get into social psychology, we get into the color and flavor of the big other, and that helps us understand certain generational pathologies which make an appearance because of socio-cultural changes and practices. The enlightenment experiences are something we have to incorporate in psychoanalysis. If we study these states profoundly enough, it's not easy because these are rare states. They can not only become goal states, but they can also become deeply healing states, even if one is able to go near them, if not into them. And the road to get to near to them are meditative practices. So with this primer, we will get into the Brahmasutras, and where possible, get into a psychoanalytic commentary. Else, we do a philosophical or a spiritual commentary. Thank you.